Harriet sat in her sun-drenched living room on the 16th floor of Ivywood Highrise, tapping her fingers on the cover of a detective novel. She had lived in the tall, stately building for nearly 10 years, and in that time, her curiosity for mysteries fueled by her love of detective stories had never really found any real outlet. The occasional missing package or a neighbour's lost keys made for paltry practice. But nothing too extraordinary ever happened in Ivywood Highrise, that was. Until a pattern of odd power outages began to plague the building. They weren't simple flickers of the lights. These were blackouts that managed to happen at the very moment something significant or suspicious occurred somewhere among the building's dozens of units. She first became aware of the pattern one afternoon while she was rearranging her small collection of antique teapots. Ivywood Highrise dipped into one of its trademark hushes. As the lights blinked out, a faint whir sounded in the hall, as though the generators tried to kick in but were somehow stifled. Harriet waited, breath held. She counted to 10, and by the time she reached 8, the robust indoor lighting surged back. She shrugged. Outages happened. Yet by dinner time, she was startled when she stepped out into the hallway and found her neighbour Mr. Carter rummaging in the hallway closet for the fuse box. "Are you all right, Mr. Carter?" she asked. He glanced over his shoulder, sheepish. "Our security lights went out. Again." Mr. Carter, a retired accountant, was typically meticulous. He disliked fuss, but also disliked puzzles left unsolved. "I'm trying to see if any circuit tripped. Over the last few days I've noticed these blackouts seem to keep happening around meal times." Harriet offered to help. Though she knew little about the building's wiring, she peered at the circuit breakers, which looked undisturbed. Nothing was obviously blown. They reset a couple of switches in hopes of preventing another blackout. But Harriet's curiosity was piqued. She tucked away the detail. The power outage had coincided with some unusual banging sounds in the hallway. Later that evening, as Harriet prepared her nightly cup of chamomile tea, she reflected on how many coincidences seemed to line up with the blackouts. This time, though, she had heard the distinct, hurried footsteps. She could only guess that maybe some neighbour had been rushing to catch the elevator, though it still seemed odd. It reminded her of the detective stories she devoured, where meaningless little details often foreshadowed bigger reveals. Over the course of the next week, more blackouts followed. The building's manager, Miss Chong, announced via the residents' email group that an electrician would be inspecting the power. Harriet watched for that electrician, expecting a swift resolution. The building was not known for letting maintenance issues fester. But days passed, and Harriet witnessed no sign of any electrician crossing the lobby. Instead, each blackout came with a new rumour swirling around the building. A missing bicycle, a broken camera in the lobby, or a neighbour complaining of strange phone calls. Harriet's detective instincts bristled. She decided it might be prudent to keep a small notebook detailing the exact times of each blackout and any suspicious happenings. Over the next few days, Harriet meticulously documented each occurrence. Monday's blackout at 7:14 p.m. had preceded a commotion in the laundry room where 3 washing machines overflowed, prompting a messy cleanup. Tuesday's blackout at 1:42 p.m. saw Miss Chong hurrying from the basement with a worried expression, although Harriet couldn't glean the reason, despite her best attempts at subtle questioning. Wednesday's blackout at 9:55 p.m. was the most intriguing. The entire corridor had gone dark, and Harriet heard a frantic whisper in the hallway. By the time the lights flicked back, nothing was out of order, at least at first glance. Eventually, Harriet managed to catch Miss Chong in the middle of the lobby. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Miss Chong was posting new notices on the community bulletin board. Harriet walked up, trying to appear casual. "Miss Chong," she began, "I was wondering if there'd been any new information about all these odd outages. I'm sure I'm not the only one concerned." Miss Chong tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and sighed. "We've had an electrician come in twice, actually. They found nothing out of place in the main panel. It's not normal at all. The city utility company insists it isn't their issue, and the hardware in the basement looks fine. We've replaced the circuit breakers just in case, but they're still happening. I just don't know what's causing them, which is frustrating." Harriet nodded sympathetically. "I can imagine. Let me know if you require help in any non-technical capacity. Sometimes an extra pair of eyes and ears can help you figure out a pattern or root cause." She smiled, trying not to give away her growing excitement at the possibility of a real puzzle to solve. She frequently heard rumors in the building's hallways and elevator rides. Mr. Delgado, who worked night shifts, overheard a rumor that someone in the building might be trying to sabotage the power for insurance scam. Meanwhile, Tasha from the 18th floor suspected something more personal, that a scorned resident was trying to cause headaches for Miss Chong's management to force her out. Harriet jotted down all these rumors. But the question remained, who stood to gain from these unexplained power outages? And how? The evidence felt scattered, no single narrative making sense yet. Then came a more serious incident. A significant break-in on the 15th floor. The rumor was that someone had entered an unlocked apartment and stolen an antique coin collection. Harriet's new friend in the building, a computer programmer named Martina, moaned about it in conversation. "It's so unsettling," Martina said. "They found no forced entry at all. It's as though the thief just walked right through the front door." Harriet gave it some thought. "Wait, did that happen during a blackout?" Martina nodded. "Of course, that's the weird thing. The occupant stepped out for just 15 minutes, came back to a pitch-black corridor, and by the time the lights returned, the coins were gone." She brushed back her curly dark hair and frowned. "I can't help thinking these blackouts are providing cover for something else." That was enough evidence for Harriet to throw caution aside and begin her own investigation. She started by focusing on the timings of the thefts and the blackouts. She performed quick interviews with neighbors she trusted, especially those who had been in communal spaces, the laundry room or the lobby, during blackouts. They all repeated the same refrain. One moment, life was normal. The next moment, everything was dark. Then, when the lights came on, some small crisis either had just happened or was underway. Instead of waiting for random occurrences, Harriet set up a vigil in her own unit, prepared with a flashlight, her notebook, and an ear pressed to her door. Inspired by her detective novels, she decided to keep watch until the next blackout, determined to see if she could isolate the cause. Several nights passed, with Harriet staying up well past midnight. Nothing out of the ordinary transpired until Saturday, when she popped some popcorn at around 10 o'clock and settled down to watch a classic mystery movie. Halfway through, her overhead lights dimmed, flickered, and finally extinguished. Adrenaline thumping, Harriet grabbed her flashlight and quietly slipped into the corridor. She scanned the corridor. All appeared still, but she heard something. Quick, light footsteps 2 floors above, echoing down the open stairwell. Without hesitation, Harriet tiptoed toward the stairwell and carefully ascended, hugging the wall. As she reached the landing between floors 17 and 18, she noticed the distinct hush of halted elevators. The footsteps sounded again, perhaps on the 18th floor. As Harriet reached the top of the stairwell, the lights blinked back. She found herself staring at a tall figure in a dark jacket at the far end of the 18th floor hallway. They froze in place, seemingly startled by the sudden illumination. Harriet couldn't make out their face, but before she could call out, the figure turned on their heel, disappeared behind a corner, and headed toward the other stairwell. Heart-pounding, Harriet rushed after them, but they were gone. She jolted to the nearest window and saw no sign of anyone fleeing the building or even messing with any external wiring. She stood there, pulse thrumming, as she tried to figure out who could be behind this. The sighting steeled her resolve. Someone was definitely taking advantage of these blackouts. But for what purpose? Small thefts, sabotage, or something bigger? It was time to go deeper. Harriet reasoned that if the building's electrical system wasn't the source, maybe someone was tampering with the backup or main lines. The basement was usually off-limits to residents, but perhaps Miss Chong would make an exception. She made an appointment to see Miss Chong the next day, under the premise of volunteering to help. Miss Chong welcomed Harriet into a cramped, windowless room where the building staff had set up an improvised maintenance office. Stacks of cardboard boxes stuffed with old records lined the walls. A small desk lamp shed a lonely glow on Miss Chong's papers, and a diagram of the building's electrical wiring. Miss Chong looked thoroughly exhausted. "You mentioned you'd be open to help," Miss Chong began, gesturing Harriet in. "Normally, this is something the management would handle, but nothing about these blackouts has been normal." Harriet leaned over the wiring diagram. It was a simplified blueprint, showing the building's main lines from the city grid, the backup diesel generator lines, plus each floor's distribution box. Harriet couldn't decipher it all, but she pretended to follow, as Miss Chong explained that every test they'd run came back normal. "And it's strange because the outages don't follow a predictable pattern. Some happen at midday, some late at night, and some early morning," Miss Chong said. "We had an outside consultant look at it. He claims this could happen if someone has direct access to the main breaker or the generator switch. But we've replaced the locks, and we keep the basement panel area under strict watch." "Could there be an electrical closet on each floor someone is messing with?" Harriet asked. Miss Chong considered. "I'm sure there is, behind those big grey doors that say electrical or utility. But they're always locked, and only the superintendent and I have keys, and we haven't lost any keys." She sighed. "I'm stumped." Harriet felt a chill of excitement. This was definitely sabotage. "Let me have a look at the basement," she said, trying her best to sound both helpful and enthusiastic rather than prying. "I watch enough detective shows, maybe a fresh pair of eyes might see something." They trooped down, weaving through the building's labyrinth of corridors. Harriet noticed the basement had multiple maintenance rooms, one for plumbing, one for the boilers, another for general storage, and one for electrical systems. The electrical room door resembled a mini vault, heavy, with steel edges. Miss Chong unlocked it, and the faint whiff of oil and dust drifted out. A large panel of switches and gauges lined one wall, while the generator took over a corner with thick cables snaking across the floor. Harriet ran her eyes over everything, but she could see no obvious sign of tampering. The padlocks were new, the bolts uncut, almost too pristine. "Could you show me the older logbooks, or the records of who has come and gone?" Harriet asked tentatively. "If you have them," Mrs. Chong indicated a metal shelf in the corner. "That's all we have. The logs are supposed to be updated every time a contractor or staff enters, but as you can see, they haven't been used diligently. Some staff are a bit lax." Harriet rifled through them, but none of it felt like it was leading anywhere. She thanked Miss Chong for her time, promising to keep her ear to the ground. Even though Harriet felt disappointed not to have found a smoking gun, her determination grew strong. Someone in the building either had the skill or a cunning method for causing these outages. Was it an inside job? Perhaps a resident with an electrical background. That evening, Harriet prepared a new plan, questioned building staff discreetly about any suspicious new hires or unusual building projects. Over the course of 2 days, she chatted with the night shift doorman, the cleaning staff, even an older electrician who had once worked as a temporary fill-in for the building, but no one had the slightest clue of a saboteur in their midst. Frustration mounted. Harriet re-examined the pattern in her notes. The blackouts rarely lasted more than a minute. The culprit's advantage must be the darkness. The perfect cloak for small thefts or sabotage. But Harriet still lacked a clear motive. At that point, Harriet decided to talk again to Martina. The break-in on the 15th floor still bothered her. She suspected that might not be the only case. And indeed, Martina had the building's gossip at her fingertips. She listed a rash of petty thefts. A prized houseplant stolen from the 14th floor, a set of custom tools gone missing from the 18th, a cameo brooch from a resident on the 17th. None were individually alarming enough to have caused a major stir, but combined, they painted the picture of a stealthy thief collecting random items, possibly an eclectic collector or someone stealing to resell. Harriet found it odd that these items were relatively lightweight, easily concealed. And then Harriet remembered seeing that tall figure on the 18th floor. Could that be the culprit making swift escapes? She reasoned that if she could catch them in the act, or at least get a better look, she might solve this puzzle. She convinced Martina to help her set a trap of sorts. Martina had a watch that beeped on the hour, which they enclosed in a small wooden box. If left near Harriet's door, perhaps it might lure a curious thief whenever a blackout hit. It was a gamble, but Harriet was out of better ideas. They sat up on a windy Friday night. Harriet had her lights dimmed and her door cracked slightly so she could peek out into the hallway. The building was silent. Most residents had retired. The hush was broken only by the hum of the air vents. Midnight approached, and then, right at 12:03, IOMM, the lights blinked off, as if on command. Harriet's heart jumped. She gripped her flashlight, poised to turn it on, but waited in silence, letting her eyes adjust. Her door was slightly ajar, letting her see the corridor's faint outlines from the emergency lights. Minutes passed. 2, 3, 4. Her heart hammered. Was nothing happening? Then she heard a soft shuffle. Someone was there. The beam of a small flashlight flitted across the walls, paused at Harriet's wooden decoy box in front of her door. She couldn't see the person's face, but they were tall, wearing dark sneakers. They knelt down to examine the box. Harriet resisted the urge to burst out, but as soon as the person touched it, Harriet flicked on her own flashlight and stepped swiftly into the hallway. The saboteurs sprang to their feet. Suddenly the corridor was awash in bright overhead light. The power had returned. For a tense second, Harriet locked eyes with the person. It was Blake, the newly hired caretaker, in training, who Harriet had seen only a couple of times. Tall and wiry, Blake had the keys to various closets and utility rooms, Harriet remembered. He was likely one of the few who could manage to sabotage the building's power, eyeing Harriet with panic. Blake took off running toward the stairwell, but Harriet gave chase. She followed him down 2 flights before Ms. Chong, alerted by Harriet earlier that day about a possible sting operation, appeared with the building's security guard. Blake skidded to a stop, realized he was cornered, and slumped in defeat. In the ensuing chaos, the building staff led Blake away, presumably to await police. Harriet's pulse pounded as she tried to piece it all together. She found Ms. Chong's eyes wide, but with a certain grateful relief. "I never suspected him," Miss Chong muttered. "He seemed so polite, so eager to learn, but come to think of it, he did have the keys." Residents gathered in the lobby after the incident, whispering in clusters, as the night shift guard kept them abreast of developments. One by one, Ms. Chong escorted them back to their floors, promising that the culprit would be dealt with. Harriet lingered, wanting to get a sense of the motive. That clarity arrived the next day, when Ms. Chong thanked Harriet for her sleuthing and shared what she'd learned in Blake's confession. Apparently, Blake had an obsessive habit of collecting unique items. He'd once been fired from a previous caretaker position for sneaking into residents' apartments and taking small trinkets. In Ivywood Highrise, he discovered how to cut the power by briefly switching off the main breaker in the electrical room. He'd do this for no more than a minute. During those few precious seconds of darkness, he stole objects he found fascinating or potentially valuable, from coin collections to cameo brooches. Because the building had a robust backup system, the lights never stayed off long, but it was enough time for him to slip around unnoticed. The repeated blackouts had seemed random, but they were always triggered when he thought he could dart into a hallway or a slightly ajar apartment door and swipe something. Harriet allowed herself a small, proud smile. The puzzle had been solved. There was something satisfying about finally putting all the small clues together. The footsteps in the stairwell, the missing items, the curious omissions in the electrical room logs. Not only had Harriet fought off the frustration of repeated dead ends, but she also managed to figure out that the sabotage had to be from someone close to the building's operations. She recalled how, in her detective novels, it was often the unassuming individual with the right access and skill who turned out to be the culprit. In the following weeks, Ivywood Highrise settled back into its usual peaceful routine. The moment the sabotage ceased, so did the blackouts. Residents breathed a collective sigh of relief. The fear of major electrical damage or a larger scheme evaporated once it became clear the entire affair had been driven by one caretaker's furtive compulsion to collect and steal. The stolen items started to surface in the caretaker's apartment, neatly stored in boxes. Ms. Chong arranged for the rightful owners to reclaim their possessions. The occupant, whose antique coin collection was taken, had tears of relief upon learning it was found intact. The lounge in the building's lobby turned into a site of frequent gratitude for Harriet. Neighbors praised her bravery and resourcefulness while passing by. Some joked that Harriet should set up a formal detective agency. Even Miss Chong teased Harriet that she might never let her move away, since the building had its own Sherlock Holmes to watch over them. Harriet, for her part, found her reading habits validated. All those nights spent with whodunits gave her a certain sense for patterns, motives, and suspicious behaviors. She felt calmer in the knowledge that her instincts had been right. Life continued at Ivywood Highrise. One crisp morning, Harriet lingered by the mailboxes, collecting her daily newspaper. Without thinking, she glanced at the overhead lights and smiled. No flickers, no blackouts, she mused quietly, relief creeping into her voice. Just then, Martina popped over, a grin brightening her face. "Hey, Harriet," Martina said. "I just wanted to thank you for letting me help in solving the building's weird puzzle. It's kind of amazing. I always thought detective stuff was just for books and TV, but we played a part in a real investigation." Harriet nodded. "It was definitely more nerve-wracking than reading my mysteries," she chuckled. "But I'm glad everything is back to normal." Martina shifted, a mischievous gleam in her eye. "You know, Harriet, if you ever want to do more investigating, perhaps we can convince Ms. Chong to hire us as official building detectives. We'll bring flashlights and everything." Harriet laughed at the notion. "You never know. Some buildings have the strangest secrets." But at least this story ended without anyone hurt. As Harriet climbed into the elevator and pressed the button to her floor, she reflected on the importance of vigilance, even in one seemingly snug building. The best mysteries, she felt, often played out under the radar of normal routine. People come and go, rarely suspecting a cunning thief in an unassuming caretaker's uniform. But Harriet understood that sometimes all it took was a sharp eye and the willingness to push a little deeper to appreciate how many small pieces collectively build the bigger picture. She stepped off the elevator, greeted by the comfortable hush of her floor. She could see the faint glow of the sun filtering in from the tall corridor window. A few neighbors waved, heading out for errands. Evening would come soon, and Harriet's mind drifted to making a pot of Earl Grey tea. She switched the lamp on in her living room, comforted that it stayed shining, steady. It was a small reassurance that the puzzle had been solved and normal life carried on. Yet, as she settled down with her teacup, Harriet felt that thrill of possibility. What if something else lurked behind the next unsolved puzzle? Just around the corner. Was there another curious occurrence waiting to surface? The notion made her smile. Although Harriet had no desire for her beloved building to be thrust back into chaos, she admitted a small part of her would welcome the chance for another cozy, solvable mystery. For now, however, she would content herself with the knowledge that Ivywood Highrise was once again safe, and that her neighbors could rest easy, untroubled by sudden blackouts and thefts, and she could get back to her detective novels until real life beckoned her for another puzzle.